There's a moment many people face after a breakup, a quiet, haunting question that lingers in the back of the mind. How can they act like they don't care anymore? And in that question lives a dangerous illusion, because what you're seeing is not always the truth. You're looking at someone who appears calm, unaffected, maybe even thriving. They seem to have moved on effortlessly, as if what you shared didn't mean nearly as much to them as it did to you. And that can feel deeply personal. It can feel like a verdict on your value. But here's what you must understand. Not all silence is peace, and not all distance is indifference. Some people don't deal with emotions by leaning in. They deal with them by stepping back, by distracting themselves, by convincing themselves they're fine before they've actually felt anything at all. So what looks like strength is often just avoidance. And when someone is avoidant, their instinct is not to process the loss, it's to escape it, to regain control by shutting the door on anything that threatens their emotional stability. That includes you. That includes the relationship. That includes the feelings they're not ready to face. So they move forward quickly. Not because they've healed, but because they've hidden. And if you measure your worth by how visibly they grieve, you will always feel like you didn't matter. But your worth was never meant to be measured by someone else's coping mechanism. Let me say that again, because this is where your power begins. Your worth is not determined by how someone else processes loss. You see, when you chase someone for answers, when you try to decode their silence, interpret their behavior, or force clarity, you unknowingly step into a cycle that keeps you stuck. You start living in reaction to them instead of rooted in yourself. And the truth is, clarity rarely comes from the person who's avoiding it. It comes from within you. It comes from recognizing that love should not feel like confusion. That connection should not require constant interpretation. That if someone truly meets you with presence, you won't have to question whether they care, you'll feel it. So instead of asking, why don't they care? Ask a more powerful question. Why am I investing my energy in someone who cannot meet me where I am? Because that question brings you back to yourself. And that's where everything changes. You stop trying to prove your value to someone who is emotionally unavailable, and you start honoring your value by choosing environments where it is recognized, respected, and reciprocated. You stop romanticizing potential, and you start responding to reality. You stop chasing closure from someone else, and you start creating it within your own standards. And when you do that, when you truly step into that place of self-respect, you realize something profound. It was never about whether they cared. It was about whether they had the capacity to love you in the way you deserved. And if they didn't, then their distance is not your rejection. It's your redirection. A redirection toward a life where you are not questioning your worth, but living in alignment with it. So don't be fooled by the illusion. Someone else's silence is not your story. Your story is still being written, and it gets to be one where you rise. Not by being chosen, but by choosing yourself every single time. Avoidant behavior often has very little to do with you, and far more to do with how someone has learned to protect themselves from emotional discomfort. When a person becomes distant, cold, or seemingly indifferent after a breakup, it can feel intensely personal, as though their withdrawal is a direct reflection of your value or the significance of the relationship. But in reality, avoidant tendencies are usually rooted in deeply ingrained emotional patterns that existed long before you came into their life. These patterns often develop as a way of coping with vulnerability. At some point, consciously or unconsciously, they learned that closeness can lead to pain, loss of control, or emotional overwhelm. So instead of leaning into connection when things get difficult, their instinct is to pull away. Not because the connection meant nothing, but because it meant enough to trigger discomfort they don't know how to handle. This is where the misunderstanding begins. You interpret their distance as a lack of care, while they experience it as a form of self-protection. The more intense the emotional situation becomes, the more likely they are to retreat inward, suppress their feelings, and create space. It's not a calculated move to hurt you. It's an automatic response designed to regulate their own internal state. The problem is that from the outside, this behavior can look incredibly convincing. They may appear calm, unaffected, even relieved. They might carry on with their life as if nothing happened. And because you are processing the loss in a more emotionally open way, their composure can feel like evidence that they didn't care as much as you did. But emotional suppression is not the same as emotional absence. Just because someone isn't expressing their feelings doesn't mean they don't have them. In fact, avoidant individuals often delay their emotional processing. What you feel immediately, they may only confront much later, if at all. And sometimes they stay so busy avoiding those feelings that they never fully acknowledge them, even to themselves. This creates a painful dynamic where you're left holding all the visible grief while they seem untouched. And it's easy, in that imbalance, to start questioning your own worth. You might think, if I mattered, they wouldn't be able to walk away so easily. But that belief is built on the assumption that everyone processes emotions in the same way, and they don't. Their way of coping is not a measure of your significance. It's also important to recognize that avoidant behavior doesn't just show up after the relationship ends. It often exists during the relationship as well, through emotional unavailability, difficulty with deep conversations, or resistance to vulnerability. These signs can be subtle at first, but they become more pronounced when pressure or conflict arises. So when the relationship ends, their instinct to detach intensifies. It's familiar territory for them. It feels safer to disconnect than to sit with the discomfort of loss, regret, or emotional exposure. Understanding this doesn't mean excusing hurtful behavior, and it certainly doesn't mean you should accept less than you deserve. But it does allow you to stop internalizing their actions as a reflection of your worth. It helps you see that their distance is not a statement about your value, but a reflection of their limitations. And when you truly grasp that, something shifts. You stop trying to decode their behavior as if it holds the answer to your self-worth. You begin to see it for what it is, a pattern, not a verdict. Emotional distance has a way of telling a story that isn't entirely true. When someone pulls back, communicates less, or appears unaffected after a breakup, it can create a powerful illusion that they no longer care. And the human mind, desperate for clarity, often fills in the gaps with the most painful interpretation possible. You begin to connect their silence with indifference, their absence with emotional detachment, and their composure with a lack of love. But what you're seeing is only the surface. Distance changes perception. When someone is no longer emotionally available to you, you lose access to the subtle cues that once reassured you: tone of voice, small gestures, the way they looked at you, the effort they made. Without those signals, your brain tries to make sense of the absence, and in doing so, it often creates a narrative that feels certain but isn't necessarily accurate. Because emotional distance is not the same as emotional erasure. When someone steps back, especially someone with avoidant tendencies, they are often creating space not because their feelings have vanished, but because those feelings have become difficult to manage. Distance becomes a buffer. It allows them to reduce the intensity of what they feel without having to confront it directly. From your perspective, it looks like they've shut off their emotions. From their perspective, they're trying not to be overwhelmed by them. This is where the illusion becomes so convincing. You might see them going about their life working, socializing, even appearing happy, and assume that they've completely moved on. But external behavior is not always a reliable indicator of internal reality. People are remarkably capable of compartmentalizing. They can function, laugh, and engage with the world while still carrying unresolved emotions beneath the surface. And because you're not part of their inner world anymore, you don't get to see what's happening underneath. So the mind fills in the blanks again. If they cared, they would show it. If they missed me, I would know. If it meant something, they wouldn't be so distant. These thoughts feel logical, but they are based on one crucial assumption: that care always expresses itself in visible, recognizable ways. It doesn't. Different people express and process emotions differently. Some lean in, seek conversation, and try to understand. Others pull away, distract themselves, and avoid anything that forces them to feel too much. Neither approach erases emotion. They simply handle it in different ways. The danger lies in equating expression with existence. When you assume that a lack of visible emotion means a lack of feeling, you begin to internalize their distance as a reflection of your worth. You start believing that you are easy to forget, easy to replace, or not significant enough to leave a lasting impact. And that belief can quietly shape how you see yourself. But their distance is not a measure of your importance. It's a measure of how they cope. There's also a deeper layer to this illusion. Emotional distance can sometimes be intentional in the sense that it helps them maintain control. When someone fears vulnerability, closeness can feel like a loss of control. By creating distance, they regain a sense of stability. They don't have to navigate complex emotions, answer difficult questions, or face the uncertainty that comes with intimacy. So they step back, they simplify, they detach, and in doing so, they unintentionally create a version of reality that feels very real to you but isn't complete. What you're experiencing is not the full truth of what they feel. It's the version of themselves they are able or willing to show. And that version is filtered through their defenses, their fears, and their emotional habits. Understanding this doesn't erase the pain of their distance. It doesn't make their silence easier to accept. But it does challenge the assumption that their behavior is a clear reflection of how much you mattered. Because sometimes, the people who seem the most unaffected are simply the ones who are the most practiced at hiding what they feel. When someone has an avoidant way of dealing with emotions, they don't move through feelings in a direct or expressive way. Instead, they manage them by creating distance internally and externally. Suppression, distraction, and detachment become their primary tools, not because they're trying to deceive anyone, but because this is the only way they know how to stay emotionally regulated. Suppression is often the first response. When something painful or overwhelming arises, they instinctively push it down. They tell themselves they're fine. They minimize what happened. They reframe the situation in a way that reduces its emotional weight. It's not that the feeling disappears, it's that they choose not to engage with it. Over time, this becomes automatic. The moment discomfort shows up, their system shuts it out before it can fully surface. From the outside, this can look like emotional strength or resilience. They don't seem shaken, they don't dwell, they don't appear to struggle. But what's really happening is a kind of emotional postponement. The feeling is still there, but it's been placed somewhere out of reach, where it won't interfere with their day-to-day functioning. Distraction then steps in to reinforce that distance. They fill their time with work, social activities, hobbies, or even new connections. Anything that keeps their mind occupied and prevents them from sitting in stillness long enough for those emotions to rise again. Busyness becomes a shield. As long as there's something to focus on, there's no need to look inward. This is why, after a breakup, they may appear to move on quickly. They immerse themselves in life, sometimes even more intensely than before. To someone who is grieving openly, this can feel almost shocking. It creates the impression that the relationship didn't leave a mark, but in reality, they are actively avoiding the very space where that mark would be felt. Detachment is the final layer, and it often shows up in how they relate to you after the relationship ends. They may become distant, unresponsive, or emotionally flat. Conversations that once felt meaningful now feel surface level or non-existent. It's as if a switch has been flipped. But this shift isn't about erasing the past, it's about protecting themselves from the vulnerability that comes with revisiting it. Detachment allows them to maintain control. If they don't engage emotionally, they don't have to face the discomfort of loss, regret, or longing. They can keep everything contained, manageable, and at a safe distance. The closer something feels to affecting them, the more they instinctively pull away. The difficulty is that these strategies are often mistaken for clarity or closure. You might think, they've accepted it, they've moved on, they're at peace. But suppression, distraction, and detachment are not the same as processing. They don't resolve emotions, they delay them or bury them. And sometimes, Those buried emotions resurface later, often when the distractions fade or when something triggers a memory. But by then, the timing is different. The context has changed, and you may no longer be there to witness or understand that process. For you, this can create a sense of imbalance. You're facing the emotions head on, trying to make sense of what happened, while they seem untouched by it all. It can feel unfair, even invalidating. But what's important to recognize is that your way of processing, feeling, reflecting, seeking, understanding is actually what leads to genuine healing. Their way keeps them comfortable in the short term, but it doesn't necessarily bring resolution. Understanding this dynamic helps you step out of comparison. You stop measuring your healing against their behavior. You stop assuming that because they aren't expressing pain, they aren't experiencing anything at all. And more importantly, you begin to see that real emotional growth doesn't come from avoiding what you feel, it comes from having the courage to face it, even when it's uncomfortable. When someone seems to move on quickly after a breakup, it can feel like the most painful kind of proof. Proof that you didn't matter as much. Proof that what you shared was replaceable. Proof that they've already found peace while you're still trying to make sense of the loss. But what looks like a clean, confident exit is often something very different beneath the surface. For many people with avoidant tendencies, moving on quickly isn't about emotional resolution, it's about emotional regulation. It's a way of restoring a sense of control after something has disrupted their internal balance. Relationships, especially meaningful ones, bring vulnerability. They require openness, emotional presence, and a willingness to sit in uncertainty. When that connection ends, it doesn't just create sadness, it can create a kind of internal chaos they don't know how to manage. So instead of slowing down and processing that experience, they speed up. They reorient their focus outward. They make quick decisions. They restructure their life in a way that minimizes emotional exposure. And sometimes, that includes stepping into new situations, new routines, new distractions, even new relationships, not because they're ready, but because it helps them avoid feeling ungrounded. From the outside, it can look like resilience, like they've accepted what happened and are simply moving forward. But there's a difference between moving forward with awareness and moving forward to escape discomfort. One is rooted in understanding, the other is driven by avoidance. Control plays a central role in this behavior. When someone feels emotionally overwhelmed, they often look for ways to regain stability. And one of the easiest ways to do that is to create distance from anything that triggers those emotions. By moving on quickly, they reduce the likelihood of having to revisit the relationship, the memories, or the unresolved feelings that come with it. It becomes a kind of emotional shortcut. But shortcuts rarely lead to real healing. Instead of sitting with the loss and allowing themselves to feel it fully, they bypass that process altogether. They convince themselves that they're fine, that it wasn't that serious, that they've already let go. And in doing so, they create a version of closure that feels convincing but isn't deeply rooted. This is why their behavior can feel so disorienting to you. You're taking the time to process, to reflect, to understand what the relationship meant and why it ended. You're engaging with the emotional reality of the situation. Meanwhile, they seem to have skipped that entire phase, and it can make you question your own pace. You might wonder if you're holding on too long, feeling too deeply, or struggling more than you should. But what you're doing is not a weakness, it's a form of honesty. You're allowing yourself to experience the full weight of something that mattered to you. That's not something to rush through. Their speed is not a measure of strength. It's often a reflection of discomfort with stillness. There's also a subtle illusion in how quickly someone can appear to replace a connection. When they engage with someone new soon after a breakup, it can feel like everything you shared has been erased or overwritten. But emotional bonds don't dissolve that easily. What's more likely is that they're using the new connection as a buffer, a way to avoid being alone with their thoughts and feelings. It's not necessarily about the new person. It's about the role that situation plays in helping them maintain emotional distance from the past. And while it may look like they've moved on completely, what they've actually done is shift their focus. Understanding this doesn't change the fact that their actions can be hurtful. It doesn't mean you should accept behavior that leaves you feeling dismissed or devalued, but it does help you separate their coping strategy from your self-worth. Because someone moving on quickly doesn't mean you were easy to forget. It often means they weren't equipped to sit with what they felt. There is something deeply convincing about a calm exterior. When someone appears composed after a breakup, steady, unbothered, even content, it sends a powerful message without a single word being spoken. It can make you feel as though they've reached a place of closure while you're still standing in the middle of unanswered questions. And that contrast can quietly lead you to a painful conclusion, that they've made peace with the ending because it simply didn't matter as much to them. But what you're witnessing is not always closure. Sometimes it's just control. A calm exterior can be a carefully maintained state, especially for someone who struggles with emotional vulnerability. Instead of expressing what they feel, they regulate it by keeping everything contained. They present a version of themselves that appears unaffected, not necessarily because they are, but because allowing anything else to show would feel too exposing. This is where perception becomes misleading. You see calmness and interpret it as emotional resolution. You assume they've processed everything, accepted the outcome, and moved forward with clarity. But true closure is not just about looking composed, it's about having actually engaged with the emotions underneath, made sense of them, and integrated the experience in a way that brings genuine peace. That kind of closure leaves a different imprint. It doesn't require performance. It doesn't rely on distance or silence to maintain stability. It carries a quiet honesty, even if it's not always visible. What you're often seeing instead is emotional management. For someone who is avoidant, maintaining a calm exterior is a way of staying in control. If they allow themselves to feel too much, they risk being pulled into a space they don't know how to navigate. So they keep things even. They keep things neutral. They keep things at a level where nothing feels overwhelming. And in doing so, they create a version of reality that looks settled but isn't necessarily resolved. This can be particularly confusing when their behavior seems consistent. They're not reaching out. They're not showing signs of distress. They're not expressing regret or longing. Everything about their demeanor suggests finality. And because you're no longer in close contact with them, you don't have access to anything beyond that surface. So the mind fills in the rest. It tells you that their calmness must mean they've let go completely, that they've found closure in a way you haven't. And that belief can slowly turn inward, becoming a quiet form of self-doubt. You start to question why you're still affected, why you're still thinking about them, why your emotions haven't settled in the same way. But you're comparing two very different processes. One is about feeling, reflecting, and gradually making sense of what happened. The other is about maintaining emotional distance to avoid discomfort. Both can look calm from the outside, but only one leads to true resolution. It's also important to recognize that people who rely on emotional control often avoid situations that might disrupt it. That means not revisiting the relationship, not engaging in deeper conversations, and not allowing themselves to sit with unresolved feelings. The calmness you see is sustained by that avoidance. It's not necessarily a sign that everything has been worked through. It's a sign that certain things are being kept out of reach. And because of that, what appears to be closure can sometimes be something else entirely. A pause, a delay, a way of holding everything together without actually opening it up. Understanding this helps you step out of the comparison. You stop measuring your healing against their appearance. You stop assuming that their composure reflects a deeper truth about the relationship or your place in it. Because someone can look completely at peace and still be avoiding the very things that would bring them there for real. There's a natural instinct, after someone pulls away, to try to make sense of it. You want answers. You want clarity. You want something that helps you understand why things changed so suddenly, or why they now seem like a completely different person. And so you reach out, sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly, hoping that if you just ask the right question or say the right thing, everything will finally make sense. But when you're dealing with someone who has avoidant tendencies, this pursuit of clarity often leads you deeper into confusion. Because the very thing you're seeking, open, honest, emotional communication, is the thing they struggle with the most. When you ask questions, they may give vague answers. When you try to talk about feelings, they may shut down or redirect the conversation. When you look for reassurance or closure, they may become distant, defensive, or even indifferent. And each of these responses leaves you with more questions than before. So you try again. You rephrase. You analyze. You revisit conversations in your mind, searching for hidden meaning. You look for patterns, clues, anything that might help you piece together a clear picture. But instead of finding certainty, you find yourself caught in a loop, thinking more, feeling more, but understanding less. This is the trap. The more you chase clarity from someone who avoids emotional depth, the more you rely on a source that cannot provide it. And over time, that reliance begins to erode your sense of stability. You start second-guessing your perceptions. You wonder if you're overreacting, misunderstanding, or expecting too much. But the issue isn't that your questions are unreasonable. It's that you're asking them in a place where they can't be answered in a meaningful way. Avoidant individuals often experience discomfort when faced with emotional intensity or accountability. So when you seek clarity, it can feel to them like pressure to explain, to feel, to engage in a way they're not prepared for. And their response to that pressure is usually to create more distance, not less. This can show up as shorter replies, delayed communication, or a complete withdrawal from the conversation. And each time this happens, it reinforces the confusion. You're left trying to interpret not just what they said, but what they didn't say, what they meant, what they felt but didn't express. And in that process, your focus shifts away from your own experience. You become so absorbed in understanding them that you lose touch with what you already know. The moments that didn't feel right, the needs that weren't being met, the patterns that left you feeling uncertain or unfulfilled. All of that gets pushed aside in the pursuit of one thing: clarity from them. But clarity doesn't come from decoding someone else's silence. It comes from recognizing what their behavior consistently shows you. If someone avoids difficult conversations, that tells you something. If they withdraw when things become emotionally significant, that tells you something. If they leave you feeling confused more often than understood, that tells you something. And those observations are already a form of clarity. The challenge is trusting them, because it can feel more comforting to believe that there's a hidden explanation waiting to be uncovered, something that will make everything make sense and perhaps even change the outcome. But when you hold on to that belief, you stay tied to a dynamic that keeps you uncertain. Letting go of that chase doesn't mean you stop caring or that you no longer want understanding. It means you stop expecting it from a place that cannot give it to you. You begin to turn inward, to reflect on your own experience, your own needs, and your own boundaries. And in doing so, something shifts. The confusion begins to clear, not because they finally explained everything, but because you stopped relying on them to do so. There comes a point where continuing to analyze someone else's behavior stops being helpful and starts becoming a quiet form of self-abandonment. You replay their words, dissect their actions, and try to decode every shift in tone or energy, believing that if you can just understand them fully, you'll finally feel at peace. But the more you stay focused on them, the further you drift from the one place where your power actually exists within yourself. Shifting your focus back to your own growth and self-respect is not about pretending you don't care. It's about choosing not to lose yourself in something that no longer nurtures you. It's about recognizing that your energy is finite, and where you invest it determines how you feel, how you heal, and how you move forward. When you're caught in the cycle of trying to figure out an avoidant ex, your attention is constantly outward. You're watching, waiting, wondering. You're measuring your progress against their actions. If they reach out, you feel a spark of hope. If they don't, you feel a wave of doubt. Your emotional state becomes tied to their behavior, and that creates a kind of instability that keeps you stuck. But the moment you begin to redirect that focus, something begins to change. You start asking different questions. Instead of what are they thinking, you ask, what do I need right now? Instead of why did they do that, you ask, how did that make me feel? And what does that tell me about what I deserve? These questions may seem simple, but they shift the entire dynamic. They bring you back into a position of awareness and choice. Self-respect plays a central role in this shift. It's not just about how you see yourself, it's about how you treat yourself in moments of uncertainty. It's about whether you continue to engage with something that leaves you confused, or whether you step back and honor your need for clarity and consistency. When you operate from self-respect, you begin to set quiet but powerful boundaries. You stop chasing conversations that go nowhere. You stop overextending yourself to maintain a connection that isn't being equally nurtured. You stop accepting emotional unavailability as something you have to work around. And this isn't about becoming distant or guarded, it's about becoming aligned. Aligned with your values, aligned with your emotional needs, aligned with the kind of connection you truly want to experience. Growth also becomes more intentional in this space. Instead of using your energy to analyze the past, you begin to invest it in yourself. You reflect not to find fault, but to gain understanding. You identify patterns, not to criticize, but to evolve. You start building a stronger sense of identity that isn't dependent on someone else's presence or approval. This doesn't mean the memories disappear or that the feelings vanish overnight, but they begin to take up less space. They no longer dominate your thoughts or dictate your mood. You become less reactive and more grounded, less focused on what was lost, and more connected to what is being created within you. There's also a quiet confidence that starts to emerge. Not the kind that needs validation, but the kind that comes from knowing you are capable of choosing yourself, even when it's difficult. You begin to trust that you can walk away from situations that don't meet you fully, and that doing so is not a loss, it's a form of self-honoring. And perhaps most importantly, you begin to see that your value was never something to be proven to someone else. It was something to be recognized and upheld by you. When your focus returns to your own growth, you stop waiting for someone else to change in order for you to feel better. You realize that your healing, your peace, and your sense of direction are not dependent on their actions. They're shaped by yours. Thank you for your time and attention. May clarity, peace, and self-respect guide your next steps. Goodbye, and take care of yourself as you move forward into stronger, wiser ground.